John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back. Before we get into the episode, just want to let you know that this is the free version of the podcast, and all that means is that we are way behind where I'm at in Patreon. So if you are loving this podcast and you need more John Constantine in your life, definitely go check us out at patreon.com/planes, trains, and comic books and sign up for the Hellblazer tier, where you'll get access to the entire Hellblazer library that I've recorded so far. And also you'll get access to the exclusive episodes of the Planes, Trains, and Comic Books main podcast. So if any of that sounds good to you, definitely go over to patreon.com/planes, trains, and comic books, all one word, and sign up there. And with that out of the way, let's get into the issue. Today, we are reading Hellblazer number 32, and just a little catch up on what's been going on. We just wrapped up the Family Man story, which was a story where John was tracking down a serial killer who ended up killing his father. So the last issue was John going to the funeral of his dad, where we found out that John's dad's ghost actually was still around because John had cursed him when he was a teenager and they got in a fight. So John has to reverse that curse, and he gets a little bit of closure, and he gets to say goodbye to his dad and close the relationship with a happy ending. And that is where we're picking up with issue 32, but first things first, we got the cover. There is a very scary and mean-looking dog who is eating a person's head. Like, the full head of a person is actually, like, long ways in their mouth, so the mouth is, like, super wide open. And we can see the teeth of the dog are very, very exaggerated in size and also in the pointiness. They're definitely made to kill or tear apart flesh. We also see on the cover that it is written by Jamie Delano and Dick Foreman with art by Steve Pugh. And this was actually interesting. I don't think Jamie Delano wrote this. I think Dick Foreman wrote this because it says in the inside credits that Dick Foreman is the guest writer for this issue. But maybe it was plotted or something by Jamie Delano. So we start off on the first page with a panel of a dog in a junkyard. And the dog is inside of like some sort of box, like a house that it's made for itself. And it's got evil red eyes, and it's also talking. So, you know, it's definitely an evil dog. And it's talking to someone who looks like maybe a older teenager, like 17, 18-year-old boy, or possibly young 20-year-old. And I only guess that because the mustache looks pretty patchy. So we'll say he's definitely a young man. And the dog is saying to him, "Oh, yes, you're a good boy, aren't you?" And we get a close-up of the boy's face as the dog's talking to him. And he looks like he's terrified. And we just hear like sloop, slop, sloop. And those noises are the dog eating something. And then we get some panels that zoom in on what he's eating, and it is a person. And as it's eating, the dog is still talking to the young man, and he says, "You've got us a fat one. That's just the ticket." And we get some more panels of the dog making really creepy sounds as he eats. And the young man begins to walk away because he doesn't obviously want to watch this happen. And as he turns, the dog says, "Wait, boy, you stay where you are. A faithful friend deserves a little reward, doesn't he?" And the boy is maybe like 15 feet from the dog's house. And the dog looks at him and says, "Down." And then the boy gets on his hands and knees. And the dog says, "This way, that's it. Here, get it down, you boy." And it turns out that the dog is sharing some of his food with this young man. The food being the dead body that's in front of the dog. So, and I guess the dog has torn out the intestines because there's a separate bowl just for this young man. And being terrified of this dog, of course, the guy eats the intestines raw in this bowl. And we see that the name of this issue is called New Tricks. And then we cut to the next day where John is waiting at a bus stop. And in front of the bus stop, I guess there's a park. And there's three women talking who have brought their dogs to play. And at first, there's two dogs that aren't getting along, and they're kind of bristling at each other and trying to see who's going to be the alpha. But one of the dogs eventually backs down and submits to the alpha dog, and it rolls over on its back, and it shows its stomach. And once it does that, the alpha dog kind of backs off and then goes to play with some other dogs. And we do see in the background that John is watching this whole thing play out while he's waiting for the bus. Then we cut to John walking towards a payphone. I'm not sure if this is on the same street as that bus stop or if he's taken the bus and gone somewhere and then gone to a payphone. but he calls someone named Tony Baxter, and we've not met them before, but it seems like Tony is a journalist who owes John a favor, and John is calling him to collect that favor, and the favor being information. I guess he keeps John up on the scoops of the day as far as like anything weird or unusual happening. But it seems like John is calling for a specific reason, like he already had something in mind that he wanted him to look up, because his friend Tony gets a file and says to John, yeah, there were a lot of disappearances around the East End, mostly known alkies from the local Simon house. Mainly no trace except for some clothing, torn and bloodstained, it says here. It's quite a juicy story, really. Kids found bones buried at the back of a playground. Some of them splintered up badly, but all recognizably human. So now that John has gotten some more information, he heads over to the Simon house, which was where a lot of homeless people were disappearing from and suspected to be those bodies that they found. And when he gets there, he talks to a man named Mike, who apparently he knows. And we find out that the Simon house is like a night shelter for people who are either drug addicts or homeless or just need a place to stay. And it's not like a permanent residence, but it's something to get you off the street for the night. So John's asking Mike about the disappearances of the homeless people. And Mike tells him there's a bunch of people that's gone missing and that there was a large police presence here when the bones were found in the play yard, but they eventually didn't find anything and lost interest, so they haven't been there for a while. And he names a specific police officer named Drummond. And Mike says, old Drummond would have kept him at it. Now there was a man to be reckoned with. He was a beefy sort of a bloke. Funny thing was, he took an early retirement. And the next thing I heard, he killed himself. But that was all before this blew up. And then John and Mike talk some more about, the people that come in and how the police aren't doing enough trying to find the murderers. And as John's about to leave, he tells Mike that he thinks it's a demon who's doing this because it has demon written all over it, but he'll keep his ear to the ground and eventually find out who did this. So John tells Mike he's going to go to a place called Sid's, I guess maybe to get some more information, and then leaves. Then we cut to the inside of the place John was going to go called Sid's. And we see it's some kind of cafe where people can hang out or something. And there's some people talking in there. And we do see that John is sitting at a table kind of a little bit far away from them, just listening. And there's one person who kind of looks like they belong in the band Poison. They have teased up blonde hair. And he's super excited because he's talking about being in a music video for the band Napalm Death, which is like a thrash metal band. And he's saying they're going to be filming this in old Charlie's junkyard. And I guess they're filming it pretty soon because this guy leaves. And as he does, there's two other men talking and they're saying that they haven't heard from old Charlie in a long time. And one of them says that they're worried because Charlie is a known heroin user. But the other man says that they shouldn't worry because Dougie, who is a young man that works for Charlie, has told him that Charlie's just fine. And the other man says, Dougie? He's soft in the head, that boy. I wouldn't listen to him. If Charlie Cutter doesn't show his face somewhere soon, someone ought to call the police. And upon hearing that, John realizes that this is probably what he's been looking for. There's a man missing, and he owned a junkyard that is still functional, apparently, but no one has seen him. So John leaves in a hurry on his way to the junkyard. Then we cut to the junkyard, and it is nighttime now, and Dougie is escorting the metalhead into the junkyard for what the metalhead thinks is the music video shoot. And as the metalhead walks in, there's no lights or anybody else there, and he says, are you sure about this, Dougie? And Dougie says, yeah, of course I am, Mark. And Mark says, and they're paying for it? Napalm Death? They got the money? And Dougie says, cash in hand. They pay good, Mark, and you'll probably get famous from this too. So as they continue to walk and talk together, Dougie slowly begins to lag behind, and Mark begins to get a little bit suspicious. He says, where is everybody? I mean, the people with the cameras and the lights and the vans and everything? And Dougie says, they're all up back, Mark, and they got loads of women there too. They got Tina Turner, the lot. Just keep going. And then Mark's like, Tina Turner? And then he turns around and he sees that Dougie is gone, and now Mark is standing there all alone. And Mark thinks Dougie's playing some kind of joke on him, and he's like, oi, come on, this is getting a bit creepy. Stop messing about, Doug. Doug, is that you? And then he hears a noise and he says, growling? And then we get a panel of Mark's face screaming in the reflection of an eyeball that is super close up. And then sometime later, we don't really know how long it's been since Mark disappeared, but John gets to the junkyard and lets himself in. And if you remember, John isn't really a big fan of junkyards because a lot of the stuff that happened in Newcastle was right outside of a junkyard. So he's kind of talking to himself about that. And as he walks in, he sees a dog, but it's not being aggressive or really doing anything. So he just kind of walks by it. And then he sees a little shed where he assumes someone might be, so he goes to check it out. And as he walks in, we see on the outside of the house, there's another dog looking at John enter. And it's definitely a different dog, so something is definitely going on with these dogs. So once in the shed, John begins to look around and, he finds the usual, like a pinup girl calendar, a box full of junk. There's like tools and stuff to do maintenance. But then he finds something more curious, something that probably shouldn't be in like a maintenance shed. And what he finds is a handmade book. And on the cover, that book says, My Story by Wes Drummond. But it doesn't say it in very nice, clean English. It says it phonetically, I guess. Like my is spelled M-I, story is spelled S-T-O-R-I. And as John reads it, he says, "Ha! Looks like the old luck's in. Just what I needed. An illiterate's autobiography." And you may have guessed it by the name on the cover of this book, but the autobiography is of the police officer named Inspector Drummond, who was talked about earlier by one of the people John went to see. And John begins to read it, and we get like a little flash of the scenes that he's reading. And it says at first, he was a cop who did his job well, and he was never recognized. No one ever gave him promotions. They always gave it to other people. And about the time he was getting ready to retire, he gets into hardcore magic, as you do. And he got a book that had incantations, he says, and he figured out a way to keep his soul on earth after his body has passed. So he does this incantation, and he kills himself with a knife, and then his soul goes around, and he says that he was looking for an adult, but unfortunately, souls defend their bodies. So he couldn't just force a soul out of an adult's body. Then he figured, okay, I'll try a baby. And even the baby soul gave him an issue. And as John's reading, he hears a click, and he turns around and he sees Donnie standing in the doorway. And I guess the click he heard was not like a gun or anything. It was just the door opening up. So Donnie sees him reading and realizes that, oh, he knows everything that's going on. So he just takes off running. And John is able to chase him down and tackle him. And he starts to yell at Donnie, asking him questions about where Charlie, the owner of the junkyard, is. And Donnie begins to answer him. But as he does, all of a sudden, this giant dog jumps off the top of the maintenance shed. And John's able to dodge the dog, but he kind of falls over and has to catch himself. And then he realizes, he's like, oh shit, demon's my arse. It's the bloody dogs, isn't it? And then about 50 dogs come from hiding, and they surround John, and Donnie's able to walk off and no one really notices him. And that's mainly because as the dogs surround him, all of a sudden, someone begins talking to John from the shadows, and as John turns, he kind of sees the head of the dog and the eyes, and the dog is saying, "Ah, it's the snooper. No doubt you've come to find out what happens to people who disappear. Well, here's your answer." And with that, he steps out of the shadows and drags the half-eaten body of the metalhead Mark into the light of the full moon, as there always is in comics. And we get a full splash page of the dog in all its glory and horrificness. His face is all covered in blood. He looks kind of like a mix of a mastiff and a pit bull and all these other things. But he has very, very large teeth, kind of like tusks, that are coming out of the sides of his mouth, and his teeth look extra big anyway. And the dog's body is super interesting too, because there's like weird, like bony protrusions on it, and it's covered in skin and everything, but it looks super skinny, but muscular. And he has like almost fingers on his paws, because he's actually grabbing the head of the body that he's eating, and he's pulling it up so he can show it to John, and he says, "See? Dog meat." And John is trying to play it cool. He's not trying to show fear or get this dog more excited. So he just starts talking back to the dog. He says, "You're Drummond then, right? My name's Constantine. So what happened, Drummond? What happened after the child?" And Drummond says, "Been reading, haven't we? Well, isn't it obvious? But you want me to tell you. You're playing for time because you're so frightened you're practically pissing yourself. Dogs can smell fear, remember?" And John, still playing it cool, says, "Maybe, but you're the one who's been getting a half-crazed kid to write your autobiography." And Drummond says, "Uh-huh. Good boy, that Dougie. He always does what he's told." And I guess just to prove the point, he begins to yell out for Dougie, and then he tells Dougie to come here, and he says, "Cigarette." So he makes Dougie give him a cigarette, and he it's so weird. Dougie puts a cigarette in between the two bottom front teeth of the dog. And even though Drummond knows John was asking to stall for time, he still tells him his story anyway. So after his soul couldn't go into the baby, Drummond went around and eventually found a English bulldog. And Drummond was able to force out the dog's soul and possess it. And at first he was just living as the normal bulldog, but then he figured out that it's easy to get power in the dog world. You just have to be tougher and willing to kill for it. So he used his human mind to kind of make political plays in the dog world. And he just started murdering any like tough alpha dogs or anything until he was the top dog in the neighborhood. And then he figured, why stop at the neighborhood? I can just continue until a whole dog empire is built. And upon hearing that, John is kind of like, what? A dog empire? And he looks at the ground and he sees like a dog food can and he says, and what's next? Hijacking Cruft's dog show or subverting the palace corgi? And then he holds the dog food can up to Drummond and he says, nah, stick to this stuff, mate. They make it for you. And Drummond doesn't like John's flippant attitude and he says, don't be smart, Constantine. Look around you. Look at me. Look at my dog Elite. We are not as we once were. We have tasted something, and it doesn't come in cans. Clutterback was fat, and the drunks were well marinated. We grew by eating them. The more we eat, the more power we gain. There are millions of dogs in this world, Constantine. Given a chance, they will kill their masters. Given a chance, dogs will have their day. And then he looks at Johns and he smirks and he says, you seem like a knowledgeable man. I shall look forward to tasting your brain. When John hears that, he drops the can kind of in fear. And the dog looks at him and says, that can, pick it up. And John hesitates for a second. And as he does, all the other dogs kind of get their hackles up and begin to growl and bark at him. So John slowly leans down and picks up the can. And as he does, Drummond says, I'm going to kill you myself. But first you get a chance. A dog's chance. Throw it as far as you can. Wherever it lands, you only have the time it takes for you to reach it before I come after you. Run in any other direction, and I will not wait. Quickly, Constantine, throw it. And John chucks it as far as he can, and Drummond says, now, fetch. And John takes off running like a bat out of hell. He looks like he's about to trip over his feet as he starts. And it doesn't seem like he threw that can very far because he reaches it pretty quickly and that dog is after him in the second that he does. And all this happening in a junkyard is actually working in John's favor because there's lots of places to hide. There's lots of things he thinks he can use to outsmart Drummond. And the first thing John tries is he sees a car and he's like, oh, I can just hide in there. Dogs don't have thumbs and they can't open the doors, so I should be safe. I should also say that we haven't seen Drummond the dog in scale with anything. We always see him by himself. And this is the first time we see kind of how exactly big he is because he's standing next to this car and he looks as big as the car. He's got to be at least 6 feet long and maybe 3 or 4 feet tall. He's gigantic. So as John slams the door of the car thinking he's safe, the dog kind of walks up to his window slowly and says, you think you're safe, do you? Well, you aren't. And we get this awesome panel of John looking terrified as he sees Drummond put his paws on the door handle. And we see his paws have thumbs and fingers like kind of starting to grow. So he's able to actually manipulate the door handle. And John is able to time this pretty well because he just moves to the other side and gets out of that door as the dog comes into the driver's side door. So he comes up with a plan to trap the dog inside the car. He shuts both doors and he says, all right, let's see you get out of that. And then as he's running away, he sees, yeah, the dog can open the door from the inside too. So then John thinks he can maybe climb some debris, like, those big piles of metal and trash. So he decides to do that. And as he does, he's still talking to Drummond. And he says, I'm getting seriously pissed off with this, Drummond. And the dog says, oh, so that's why you're climbing up a junk heap in abject terror. And John is still putting up a front. He's trying to play it cool. And he says, nah, I'm just doing it for the exercise, mate. But he's actually able to kind of hide and conceal himself. And the dog says that, John can't hide from him. Obviously, he can smell him and stuff. And I'm not sure how long John waits there, but Drummond eventually does go away, probably trying to trick John to come down. But I guess John thinks it's worth a shot. Maybe he can get out of here. So he does come down. And the second he walks around one of the corners of the garbage, he sees the dogs right there. And then Drummond says, bad strategy, Constantine. So John's on the run again, and eventually he gets to that maintenance shed from earlier. And the reason he goes there is because he remembers that there was like a can of turpentine and anything else that he can think of to cover his scent. So he dumps turpentine all over his coat, and then he looks around and he sees salt and pepper, and he throws that on himself as well, and also all over the shed, because he's got a plan now. So he leaves the shed and lets himself be found by Drummond. And when the dog sees him, he says, "You want to throw another can, Constantine?" And John says, "Screw you, Drummond. You don't know who you're messing with." But then he takes off and runs back towards the maintenance shed, and the dog is like, "Well, show me who I'm messing with when you finally stop running." And he quickly follows behind John into the maintenance shed. And when John gets there, it's not a very big place, so I don't know exactly how this works, but he's able to confuse Drummond because the scent of the shed is the same as him because it's also full of turpentine and salt and pepper. And John also turns on a radio, which begins to play Hound Dog by Elvis, of course. And with the noise and his scent covered, John is able to sneak out from behind the door and make his way behind Drummond and out of the shed. But unfortunately, that trick didn't work very well because obviously the shed's pretty small. And so as John's running, we already hear a snarl. We see Drummond running after him. And John, seeing, there's nowhere to go, he doesn't have anywhere else to hide, he quickly turns around, and we don't see why he does this exactly, but we can assume that from the beginning when he saw the dogs in the park and see how they played, he decides to copy that. So he turns around, drops down, and rolls over on his back so his stomach is exposed, and basically submits to Drummond. And earlier when Drummond was talking about how the dog world is so easy and simple, part of his reasons for liking that was because there were very strict rules, like things that were done because you're dogs and their instincts, and they will always follow that. So when Drummond runs up to John, who's submitting, Drummond does not attack him immediately, and John says, "You can't do it, can you? You're pre-programmed, mate. So long as I do this, your instincts won't let you touch me. But of course, I'm not a dog, am I? So I can cheat." And he reaches into his pocket and he pulls out the canister of pepper that he found earlier, and he pops the lid and he throws the rest of the contents inside the pepper canister in the dog's face. And this works like a charm. Drummond is uncontrollably sneezing and can't really fight or do anything, so he's defenseless now. So John walks over to one of the junk piles and he grabs a pipe with a large piece of steel at the end of it, and he grabs that and he walks back over to Drummond and he says, "Yeah, there's advantages to being human. When you think about it, there's opposable thumbs for a start. They're really useful." And as he says that, he swings the pipe up behind his head and brings it down as hard as he can and smacks the dog in the face. And does quite a bit of damage. It basically collapses the right eye of the dog. And in response to this, Drummond looks around and he sees the hundreds of dogs that are still in the junkyard, and he begins to bark at them, trying to command them to attack John. But John's like, "It's no good, Drummond. Like you said, dogs know their politics." And with that, John swings the pipe again and hits the dog right in the nose, and he says, "They know a loser when they can smell one." So now Drummond's all defeated and his face is all fucked up, and he looks at John and he says, "Bulldogs never give up." And John responds, "Bullshit." And then he proceeds to beat the dog to death. And with his last breath, Drummond says, "You've killed me. I wonder what I shall come back as next." And John says to him, "I shouldn't bother if I were you, mate." And then John turns and walks away, and as he does, all the dogs begin to surround Drummond's body and bark and howl. And the narration says, "They seem to sense something ascending." And John seems to feel it too, because as he turns around, the narration says, "And then it's gone." And then as John's walking out, we see Donnie also kind of screaming and crying, like he's sad that Drummond died. But John doesn't say anything to him. He just lets him cry. And then John opens the gates of the junkyard and lets all the dogs out. And the narration continues, "Drummond was right about one thing. This bloody country has gone to them. The dogs. Could be worse, though. At least dogs are stupid. There's some species I'd rather not think about." And then we get a panel, the last panel of the comic. It's a zoom out where we see John walking far away out of the junkyard, and we get in the foreground, close to us, there's a rat, and it's got red eyes, and it looks like it's about to attack another rat. So it seems Drummond has lived on. And that is the end of the issue. So if y'all have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrainsandcomicbooks, all one word, @gmail.com, and we will see y'all in the next one.